The National Geographic is well known. Steve McCurry is well known. He's going to do a good job. In the Pashtun community that Sharbat Gula, the Afghan girl, was from, trust is built based on relationships. If I don't know you, I can't trust you and trust that your intentions are good. So in that case, intuitively, before I studied all these frameworks, our team knew we had to spend time investing in a relationship and building that trust.
If the trust is cracked, where do we stand? Who keeps score when the facts land? This is media in the margins. Media in the margins.
I have a transparency statement that I start my podcast with. And so I like to tell everyone this just to get us on the same page here. So this podcast approaches journalism as a public, evolving process rather than a finished product. We treat knowledge making as something that's developed through dialogue, not delivered as final authority. And while we retain editorial control, our goal is to make parts of the process visible in its uncertainties, its limits, and its revisions over time. So corrections and updates will be documented in the show notes. For context, I'm currently affiliated with Oslo Met University in the Department of Photojournalism. And for reference and full transparency, Carrie Regan and I did work together once long ago at National Geographic. And this conversation is being recorded on April 9th, 2026. And with that, I think we can begin. For this conversation, we'll be focusing on the transition from institutional media to independent founder-led storytelling, what's gained, what's lost, and what it actually takes to build something sustainable outside traditional structures. And perhaps we'll sprinkle in a little bit about Carrie's knowledge with our special guest, Carrie Regan, her knowledge on cultural connection and communication, since we touched on that before we started. Carrie, can I call you Carrie in this?
Please. Yes, please.
Here's a little bio. Carrie Regan is a media strategist, producer, and podcast host with over 25 years experience developing and pitching global television content, including more than a decade at National Geographic Television. She now runs her own media consultancy and hosts a podcast exploring entrepreneurial pivots. The show is called My Great Pivot, a podcast featuring candid interviews with women who've reinvented themselves. I'm especially interested in how Carrie's experience is with global media that informs our understanding and shift of media today. And she's a great example of a transition figure between legacy media production, global storytelling, and entrepreneurial media creation. Did I get that right? Do you want to add anything?
No, that sounds fantastic.
Okay.
I'm impressed with myself. Wow.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good. I'm impressed also. We have so much to talk about to squeeze in an hour. I think we might have to revisit this at a later time, but let's start with some lightning round, kind of quicker questions, if you don't mind.
Fire away.
Okay. When you were at National Geographic, did you consider yourself a journalist?
That's a good question. I would say it depends on the story I was working on. In some stories, I really felt like I was trying to uncover some truth. I do feel like a lot of times, unlike what journalists are truly supposed to do, I was going in with a strong preconceived bent and opinion on the subject matter. So in that sense, I think I was not really being a journalist in the true sense of the word. I like to think that I was leaving my mind open to be challenged. But I'll take, for example, I developed a show about people who keep big cats, lions, and tigers as pets in their homes. It's really hard for me to go into a situation like that and leave my mind open to the fact that there could be some good in keeping lions and tigers as pets in a home, including, say, one woman who was running a daycare for children in her basement and had lions and tigers as pets in her home. So I like to think that a journalist would go into that with their mind open and wanting to probe all sides of that, including the positive and the negative. Again, I'd done my research. I knew about a lot of cases that were really dangerous. Somebody had their arm ripped off, a young boy, So I went in maybe a little tainted. But and then there were other stories that we purely did because I don't know, they scratched an itch for our viewers, shows about megastructures or factories and how things were made. Is that really journalistic? Maybe, because we're reporting on this topic. But for me, we weren't, you know, probing the depths of important topics of the day and trying to uncover truths.
So, what about now? Would you consider the work you're doing more journalistic? Would you label yourself a journalist?
Huh. That's a good question. I don't know. How would you define a journalist? I'll throw it back at you.
This is what I was going to ask you, what your definition of, because I'm focusing kind of on independent creator journalists, and I'm looking for, there isn't one answer for what the definition is. And so I am looking to people to help me kind of define it.
Yeah.
And there are people who label themselves a journalist, and there's people doing journalistic work who are not labeling themselves as journalists. And so there's this kind of gray area, and I'm curious about kind of exploring that with how people label themselves, what type of work they're doing, and then how they define that work. So I couldn't, so that's why I'm curious. And when I look back at Geographic, I didn't necessarily label myself a journalist at that time.
Yeah.
A lot of times I was doing heavy journalistic work, investigative type work. I was making sure we had representation from all sides and deep research and annotated scripts and all these things. So I was just curious. It struck me. So that's why I asked. So maybe just throw out what maybe independent, or do you consider yourself a journalist now or doing journalist work? And what is that definition?
I will say that, yes, with our work in National Geographic, there was this commitment to the truth. We knew in a way that was a practice that I didn't observe in other places that I went to working in unscripted television. We had to come up with 3 independent sources, legitimate sources to back every fact in a script. And so I think that was a very journalistic part of that process. Now I would say I would describe myself more as a storyteller than a journalist. And so as a storyteller, I feel like I am going in with a preconceived notion of how I want my listeners or my viewers to feel, as opposed to a journalist where I'm letting the content speak for itself, if that makes sense.
As you look at yourself as a storyteller, is it more difficult to be a storyteller or to build a business?
I would say to build a business. I feel like, from ancestral times, people sat around the stories and could tell. From ancestral times, people sat around the fires telling stories. Anyone can be a storyteller. As children, we have infants, 4-year-olds who come to us telling very elaborate stories, right? Now, get that 4-year-old to make money doing that, that's the trickier part. Especially these days when there are so many tools that allow people to tell stories and distribute their stories. I think, and we can touch on this further, but I think this is an amazing time to be living in. It really is this golden era where mass media really has become democratized. We have the tools in our hands, literally. You have an iPhone in your hand. You can produce a story, you can film a story, you can edit that story, and you can distribute it globally. Can you imagine telling someone that you could do this 30 years ago, saying, with this little box that I have in my hand that costs maybe $800, not a few $100, but, under $1,000, I can film you, I can edit you, I can record you, I can edit you, and I can send this message around the world, share it with a global audience. But at the same time, because all of those tools are so widely accessible, it means that there's so much content out there that it's hard for those stories to be discovered. And so that tremendous amount of content that's being generated makes it harder to build a business out of it. How do you get that audience looking at your content when there's so much content being generated? And how then do you monetize that audience? You need that audience in order to monetize it, in order to build that business. And then there's the whole question of, well, should monetizing the audience be a goal, or should it be storytelling for the sake of storytelling and something pure? Well, my argument is if you're not making money doing it, you can only do it for so long before that runway runs out.
That's actually one of the things I wanted to talk to you about as far as learning from your audience and then monetizing that and being sustainable, because that, I think, from what I've learned in interviews so far, is one of the biggest hurdles for people starting out in the creator arena. So, can you tell me what you've learned and what you can kind of, or what you've done in your research of knowing people or working around the world? What can people do to gain the trust of audiences and build their audience and then monetize it?
I think it all starts with, are you creating a product that audiences want and will be drawn to? And that's like any product, even if you're developing an app, if you're building a widget, is there a market for that? Starting with the audience first, and do what kind of stories are they gravitating toward? So for me personally, I was doing an MBA. I went back to school in my 50s to get an MBA. I'd been thinking about it for 30 years, and it felt like no time like the present 30 years later. I finally made that plunge. I make decisions very, very, very slowly. So I was learning all of these things in class, but I really wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to truth check them against case studies. And I found myself really drawn to the stories of female founders, surrounded by a number of them. And for me, I'm very risk averse. Again, took me 30 years to decide to go and do this MBA. What made them want to leave stable jobs and go and pursue a startup, build a business of their own where there was no guarantee of success? Some of them quit really stable jobs. There's one woman who was an engineer and walked away from that job after 6 months to go and launch her own photo studio. There's another woman who had a very secure job in marketing with a Fortune 100 company. She was a director in marketing, and she left to start her own startup. For me, someone who is so risk averse, I always had this desire to start my own business, but it was always also very terrifying to me to walk away from that security, especially in the United States where you don't have universal health care, and health insurance is so expensive. So is it responsible to go and walk away from that when you have family and you have all of these other responsibilities weighing on you? So for me, going and examining these stories, I was not only drawn to it as a storyteller because they are so dramatic. There's that beginning, there's that messy middle, and then there's the present, not necessarily the end, but where it's all led them. But I was also drawn to them as an aspiring founder. What made the women make these decisions and what made them take the leap? And how do they overcome the doubts that we all face daily? And so I've learned a lot from them in terms of how you identify that audience, how you develop new products, how you know how much runway you have and when it's time to go and look for outside funding, and how to monetize these products that you're creating, whether it's an app or a service or a podcast.
So, how many interviews have you done so far? And what have you found? Can you boil it down to some secret sauce that these women have?
I wish I could say there's a secret sauce. I've done over a dozen interviews so far. I've launched the podcast just under 3 months ago, but I actually started some of these interviews. I'm ashamed to say some of them are about a year, more than a year old. It took me forever to get it out. And part of that was that I come from the production world where if you're creating an hour-long story, as you know, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, we had 16 weeks to put together an hour-long show. And then that cut back to 12 weeks and then 8 weeks. But even 8 weeks is unheard of if you're working on a podcast. You've got to crank through that edit, I mean, even if you take a full day or two to do it, that's really luxurious in the podcasting world. And that's why I've realized these bumps and the edit isn't always perfect and the audio isn't always perfect and the video cuts are sometimes harsh. you can't take that time that you do take to produce an hour for television or even a half an hour for television. You can't take that when you're making a podcast. You'll never get it out. You'll be producing one podcast every 3 months. In terms of the secret sauce and these founders, I think everyone has been different. We've had founders who have had a bit of a bankroll in order to go and launch their businesses. Some who've had partners who've been able to pay the bills, and they've been that foundation that they've had partners who've been able to offer support, and that's been given them the leeway to be able to experiment and launch their own business. Some have left companies and have had severance packages, and they've been able to use that. Others just took a flying leap. Again, some of these dramatic stories. This one woman who talked about investing in buying a studio for her business. She had 2 small children, and her husband was working in the business with her. And she talked about how she went to the grocery store the night before the grand opening of her studio, and she wanted to buy a rotisserie chicken for her kids for dinner. And every credit card she had was declined. So contrast her with somebody else who said, I was not willing. I'd heard too many stories when I got my MBA about founders who had lost everything, and that was not going to be me. So I knew how much money I would need to be making monthly. I knew how much time I would have. I knew when I would have to raise by. She had a $1 million pre-seed funding round, and then she knew before that funding ran out what date it would run out and how she needed to start looking for funding 4 months before that. So everyone's different. Some had, again, partners who were funding, paying the household bills and able to pay the household bills while they ramped up their business, and others who were willing to sort of gut it out on a shoestring until it worked.
So you're interviewing people about their big pivot, women in particular, and then you are a woman who took this big pivot. So I'm really curious. I don't know if maybe an episode you interview yourself, but how did you decide to make this big leap? And what was it about legacy media that wasn't making you, I don't know, satisfied anymore?
Yeah. And it is very meta. I'm interviewing these women who made these great pivots and trying to draw strength from them and confidence so that I can make my own pivot. I will say that one common element in the secret sauce that they've all had is that, to go back to your previous question, Edit, one common element among these women is that they've noticed a need from their environment around them. And I think that women are very perceptive in that way. I think women, for better or worse, tend to be people pleasers and very attuned to our audience and our surroundings, people around us and their needs. And so a lot of them, their business has sprouted from seeing a need or seeing what's worked over here and introducing it in a new market. So I would say that that's a common thread for a lot of the women. For example, there's one founder who saw that her daughter was involved in after-school sports. And she was basically bonking, as we say, running out of energy, not performing at her best. So she's introduced this product called Fuel Box, which has specially developed nutritional supplements, specially developed hydration packs and a snack bar, fuel for her kids who are participating in after-school sports so that they can perform at their best, and consulted a nutritionist. So she has high-carb snacks for before the sports and then protein after the sports. Again, something that she discovered from her environment around her, a need that wasn't being met. There was another woman who was a busy professional, and she saw that she didn't have time to make the healthy meals that her mom always made when she was growing up for her family. When she got home from work, she was too tired. So she created an app that's a platform that connects families that don't have time to prepare healthy meals with chefs who have extra time and can basically come into their homes and make those meals for them, and make them affordably by creating enough meals for 5 meals. So they make one meal for the dinner that night and then package up the rest and put it in the freezer. So we'd all love to have a home chef. We can't all afford it, but this made it, that bulk preparation made it more affordable. So she's solving that problem. So I think a lot of these women have looked at the environment around them and solved problems that they've seen, which has been really, really inspirational. And what I'm trying to draw from that is I see that there is this huge trend of women who want to start their own businesses. In the past few years, women in the United States have created new businesses at twice the rate of men. There's increasing desire for independence, for flexibility in schedules, and that's driving a lot more women to create businesses as well these days. And so I see a need for a podcast that shares stories of these women who've been in their shoes and who want to share, want to learn from their experience. So that's the need that I'm trying to fit. And then creating a larger platform beyond the podcast at .com, where we have resources and other tools where women can learn and build their own businesses.
What you observed while you were in legacy media as what was missing, or where's the niche you're going to fill that you know, in that arena that you transferred to your personal endeavor, your entrepreneurship?
I think that legacy media, by its very definition, it has to broadcast. It has to hit a fairly broad audience in order to cover the incredible production costs required to churn out an hour of cable TV, which is far less expensive, as we know, than an hour of dramatic television. That's even more expensive. And so I think that there's so much opportunity, especially with podcasts, to be able to produce them without needing a whole lot of resources. And when you can do that, you can hit more, as you said, more of a niche market. It'd be really hard to produce content just for a niche market like aspiring female founders and have that on mainstream TV. The other problem would be that for it to be a success, you need, in a lot of cases, you need the big dramatic moments, the big payoffs. And I think that's led to a lot of humiliation television, where you have these shows where somebody goes into a struggling business and they try and help turn that business around. And there have been complaints and oftentimes lawsuits after the fact that the show has amplified the problems that this business has faced, and it's had adverse impact on that business as a result. But that kind of drama is something that the audience craves, and a network is going to be demanding in order to make an hour of dramatic television. For me, reality, and I'm talking about real reality, not reality television, which we know is a lot of times really manipulated, but reality is dramatic enough in a lot of these cases. You know, there's no need to play it up. As I said, you know, with the story of this founder who went to the grocery store and her credit cards are all being declined, just trying to buy a rotisserie chicken for her kids for dinner because she's invested everything she owns into her business. What could be more dramatic than that? You know? So I think that there's this great opportunity to be able to tell these stories that are inherently dramatic without having a network executive, and I say this having been a network executive, without having a network executive breathing down your neck and telling you, no, change this, add that. You know, it allows you to trust your instincts. And that network executive is just acting on their own instincts as well. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but it's a fertile playground to be able to trust your instincts and go with these stories. What I want to say, and tell these stories in the way that you want to tell them and believe they should be told.
What do you feel like is being or was being left out of the conversations in legacy media that you're able to conversely apply to your storytelling now?
You know, it's proven that women get less media coverage than men. I think it's about in the news media, they get about a quarter of the coverage of men, or they're covered a quarter of the time, 25% of the time. Women's business stories are covered at a fraction of the percentage of men's business stories. And a lot of the business media that's out there are covering these big unicorns. They're covering billion-dollar businesses. And I understand why. Those stories are really, really dramatic, and they're impacting the stock market, and they're impacting our retirement accounts. But these stories of these everyday entrepreneurs who are just want enough to cover their daily bills. They just want to be able to feed their families and give their families a comfortable lifestyle. You don't hear a lot about those. And yet it's what so many people, especially women, so many women aspire to. And so I feel like there isn't room in traditional media to celebrate those stories of the women who are out there and creating their own businesses that aren't necessarily the billion-dollar businesses, but at the same time, they're creating something that's really, really special. There's one founder who I just interviewed who is, she's been working in television. She has a moderate to severely autistic child. During COVID, caretakers weren't able to come in and help her with the care for her child. And so she was told by experts, so a lot of that care fell on her. And she was told by experts that her son would never be hygiene independent. He would never be able to care for himself and wash himself and take care of the everyday activities of daily life himself, showering, going to the bathroom. She refused to accept that. And so she came up and developed this suite of tools to help her son be more independent in the shower, in the bathroom, using the expertise that she had gleaned from interacting with her son every day. She came up with a line of shower curtains with drawings that show the different steps for getting clean. And she recognized that with this population, continuity of imagery is really important. So she created a book, one for boys, one for girls, that showed the proper steps for how to shower using the same imagery that was on the shower curtain, and then created a checklist, again, with the same imagery. Okay, I've washed this part, I've washed this part, I've washed this part. So, that's incredible. And she's now sharing these tools with other families that are really appreciating that this is out there in a market where a lot of the tools like this are very cold and clinical. And so this is someone who's having a tremendous impact on this population. She's also employing disabled adults. She's going through an organization that employs disabled adults to create and assemble these products. And so what a tremendous impact this person is having on her community. But how widely would that story be disseminated? Maybe local news, but to be able to put it on a platform where people are hearing the story globally and it's inspiring people globally. I mean, that's just fantastic. We have another element that I'm super excited about. As I said, I started doing these interviews not knowing what I was going to do with them. It's turned into this podcast. And around this podcast, I've created this platform, the Female Founders Project. And I wasn't sure what I would do with this platform. I wanted something that celebrated and inspired women and offered them the tools to grow their own businesses. There are a lot of platforms out there that offer downloadable educational tools and workshops on how to launch your own business. I didn't want to necessarily just add to that mix. And so I've been seeking, what will be the end product of this? What will set it apart from all the rest? And one of my interviewees inspired me. In the middle of the podcast, when we were talking about how she was going to grow her custom cake business, she said, I have an industrial mixer, but I really need a bigger one. I need to step up to a 15, 16 quart mixer. If there's anyone out there who has a used 15, 16 quart mixer, restaurants are always looking to get rid of their old stuff, let me know. And so it gave me an idea. She said, I'm willing to buy it, but I just don't have the time to go looking for it. These female founders, a lot of times they're the only ones on the payroll. They're doing 10 different jobs. I said, why don't we create a female founders wish list? What's something small, relatively inexpensive, under a few $1,000s, a service or a product that could change their business today, have a tremendous impact on it, or at least make their lives a little easier. And we'll create the Female Founders wish list on the website, and I'll ask every founder during the podcast, what's one service or item that could transform your business today or make your life a little easier? They'll share it, and if somebody can fulfill that wish list item, we'll give them a shout out on the podcast, and we'll create a lovely video that will hopefully go viral celebrating their contribution to this person's business. So for me, that's a way of celebrating these women and showing them that we support them, that they're not alone. And it's a way that this podcast can contribute to these women everything they're doing, even in a small way.
That's such a great idea. That's an actionable item that you are now going to inspire me to come up with a small thing that I can tack on after maybe next season. I'll start that. I really like that idea.
Yeah, it's sort of that combination, that good feeling that you get from giving to a GoFundMe
Yeah.
and then seeing an Upworthy video,
Yeah.
And that just with one of my very first guests, she is building a business, and this is one that could be a unicorn, who knows? But she's been inspired to help reduce plastic waste by creating a plastic wrap alternative out of vegetable peels that dissolves in water. So if you're making pasta, you rinse it under the sink and you toss the pasta and the packaging into the water and it dissolves. And she had a friends and family round, and I was able to contribute to that friends and family round. And it wasn't much money, but what a great feeling. I still feel like, wow, I am a small part of this company and I am helping bring something that's really meaningful out into the world.
Is it a lot more difficult to sell the intangible or the idea of storytelling or media, which people can't hold on to, something that's digital, to fund that?
Yeah, well, my hope now on the website, there are a lot of companies that are looking for affiliates. And so I've started to introduce affiliates and discounts from affiliates on the website, and I'll eventually work some of those into the podcast as well. That's
Yeah.
small.
Yeah.
Affiliate deals aren't bringing in major cash. But if the female founders wish list is able to gain traction, what product wouldn't want to get behind that? Be it TurboTax or QuickBooks, for QuickBooks to be able to fulfill one of these wishes, that's again just a few $1,000s, and then have that positive PR that comes from it through
But
a video.
not sponsored in this podcast.
No,
Not yet.
I
Sorry.
invite QuickBooks to sponsor both of us, but it is not sponsored yet. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just think that's such a great idea, and really following through with sustainable or hopefully sustainable circular business plan, a great idea, because that's what is difficult with the storytelling creator platform, I would say, which right now for many people is dependent on algorithms. And I didn't know if you could speak to your experience with audiences and algorithms.
It's, it is so hard. And I'm Gen X, and I feel like Gen X has this aversion to drawing attention to ourselves. Maybe not all Gen Xers, but I certainly have, when I speak to a lot of people from my generation, social media, just the idea of having to go and build a following and draw attention to ourselves. Ugh. It's just something that feels so distasteful. Maybe the secret is to just have a Gen A. Is that what Gen Alpha? A Gen Alpha on our team? Make them our first hire? If there's a reason why a lot of job listings, when you look at job listings, they're looking for quote unquote digital natives. It feels like these kids grow up knowing how to do this automatically. So it is really tough. And when you're producing all the content yourself, churning out the volume of content is a challenge. You can enlist AI tools, but then the quality can be mixed. And do you want to be part of that movement that is watering down these platforms with a lot of AI slop that isn't really thoughtful and thought through? I don't want to be. I'm picking up a few tips in terms of the algorithm. I've learned just recently, and maybe.
Hey, this is a non-commercial commercial, and the only break I'm taking in this entire podcast to make one request. If you're enjoying this content, guess what? We're not getting paid for this at all. So it would really help us if you would share, subscribe, follow, like all of those fun things that take a couple seconds, a minute of your time, means so much to us, and technically doesn't cost a thing. So with that, back to the show. Thanks for listening. Oh, I almost forgot. I also would love you to comment. Let us know what we're getting right. Let us know what we're getting wrong and what you'd like to see more of.
maybe everyone knows this, not to put a link in LinkedIn posts because they will suppress posts that have links in them. You have to put them in the comments. I've been wondering forever, why are people putting these links in the comments instead of putting in their posts? That's why the algorithm will suppress it. So I'm learning a little bit more about how to navigate all that, how to on Facebook ads if I want to throw a few dollars at promoting a video, figuring out how to fine tune my audience. But it's tricky, especially for us folks who didn't grow up in the social media era.
Yeah. That would be me also. I'm straddling. I'm 1979. I think they're calling us Zennials. Right now, there's a lot of messiness with AI, messiness with this is my connector sentence, and messiness in the middle, which I'm wondering because you talk about messiness in the middle.
Yes.
That's a kind of term you've coined, a portion of, I guess, in the middle entrepreneurship. But do you want to talk about your personal experience? Are you in the messy middle right now?
I am 100% in the messy middle. And that's why I love these stories of the messy middle. Again, they make me feel like I am not alone, especially for the media industry. I mean, you've been in the media industry. We all know, those of us who've been in unscripted media, how much that industry has changed over the last 20 years. I realized I was laid off at National Geographic after 14 years, and then I was with Scripps Networks, which was bought by Discovery Networks, which was then merged with Warner Brothers to become Warner Brothers Discovery, and laid off after 10 years. And just lasting 10 years at these companies was huge. But I realized during the last round of layoffs that went on for years until my number came up, I've spent more than half my career in unscripted media under the shadow of constant layoffs. And so now there's this stress where I am in this messy middle where I am sort of figuring out what should be my focus during these next few years of my career. But it's really energizing. I mean, there's going to be constant financial stress. You can't get away from that. I mean, our health insurance alone for just me and my husband, just our premium alone is $28,000 this year. That's before we go to a doctor. That's just to make sure that we have any kind of coverage if we need to go to a doctor. And then on top of that, we have a $15,000 deductible, which means we still have to pay the first $15,000 of medical costs before anything is covered. And then it's only covered at 50%. I mean, it's just insanity. So even though I've saved over years and I have a cushion for this time, and I knew I would need this cushion because my number would eventually come up, there's this constant stress, I've got my bonus boy, my stepson, who's going to be maybe headed to college in a couple of years. He graduates from high school. And so there's the college costs. And then there's, will there be work for him? Will there be work for this next generation? So I am in the messy middle and I'm constantly contending with, okay, I have a family, I have these financial responsibilities and this pressure for something to take off and get traction soon. And that can be a really scary time. But I have really found strength in doing these interviews and hearing from these other women and how they've powered through them. And that's one of the questions I always ask them. What do you do when these self-doubts surface? And the women have been extraordinary in that they really do talk about these vulnerable moments. And for all of them, they talk about, focusing. There's one woman, Gayla, who created Fuel Box, this nutritional packet for after school athletes. She talked about focusing on your why, and if there is this strong reason that you are connected to, that you believe in, it's going to help power you through those difficult times. Same thing with Erica Tuggle. She talks about this. She's the founder of Live In, this platform that connects families with at-home chefs. And she said she entertained a few different ideas, but you really have to believe in the idea that you are creating for that idea to power you through all the difficult times and make you want to really devote your life to this idea 24/7 because it can be all consuming. So all of these words of wisdom have really helped guide me as I determine what I want to pursue next. And I've tried not to have it all figured out from the start, and that's part of the messy middle. I think sometimes we feel like we need to have that business plan from day one. And if you're locked into that business plan and you don't allow yourself the flexibility, you're going to be more likely to fail. You have to listen to the marketplace and let it guide you. And so I've tried to allow that to happen. And I've found that that has served me well in terms of helping me find what direction is going to be most lucrative, maybe, or most, I don't know, what direction will really set my product apart.
How do you use your experience and expertise from different cultures to kind of think about the idea of trust and the importance of trust in media production?
That's an interesting question. I've been doing a lot of I've been doing a lot of cross-cultural work. This is my twin passion. So I've been working on the podcast celebrating female founders while also developing a consultancy. Globally Minded is the name of my consultancy that helps teams and leaders and individuals work more effectively across cultures. And that's come from a lot of my history from growing up in a very multicultural town where my closest friends growing up were first-generation Americans or immigrants themselves. My first time traveling abroad was studying abroad in Niger in West Africa, which was very different from the United States. And then I did Peace Corps for 3 years. I was a public health volunteer in Guinea, in West Africa, and then did this work with Peace Corps where I was, did this work, and then I did this work. Then I went on to work with National Geographic, where I was traveling and working across a lot of different cultures. And then when I went on to work with Warner Brothers Discovery, I oversaw global collaborations as well, a lot of them between the US and UK, and a production team and studio that we owned, a broadcaster that we owned in Poland, TVN. And I saw that some collaborations worked really well and some didn't. And that drove me during my MBA to really dive into the subject of cross-cultural management and understand and study a lot of different frameworks about how trust is built. And there are tremendous distinctions. I think all cultures are on a spectrum, but for some, trust is built through performance, and others, trust is built through relationships. An example, when we were in Pakistan looking for the Afghan Girl, the subject of the famous National Geographic photo. If you went to an American and said, National Geographic wants to take your picture and we're going to have this celebrated photographer, Steve McCurry, do it, well, America is very much a performance-based, trust-building culture. In other words, trust is built based on your record and your performance. And National Geographic is well known. Steve McCurry is well known. He's going to do a good job. In the Pashtun community that Sharbat Gula, the Afghan Girl, was from, trust is built based on relationships. Do I know you? Do I know who you are? How do I know you're going to do a good job? Who cares if National Geographic's well known and Steve McCurry is well known? If I don't know you, I can't trust you and trust that your intentions are good. So in that case, intuitively, before I studied all these frameworks, our team knew we had to spend time investing in a relationship and building that trust. Now, when I go to do the podcast, it's challenging because when you're in your first season, as you know, you don't have that performance track record, So when you're reaching out to complete strangers, as I was in at least half of the interviews, I needed to draw on my experience from National Geographic as a storyteller, as a former vice president at National Geographic and producer and vice president at Warner Brothers Discovery. That performance record is what I think gave people the confidence to trust me with their story. And where that might have not sealed the connection, I went through former colleagues who knew them, or I'd find somebody in common, a friend in common, to vouch for me. And so every individual is different, not all Americans, or, I interviewed some people from international communities too, but not everyone is going to trust you based purely on your performance record. Some are going to trust you based on who you know. And so when I would do this cold outreach, I would try to tout my record and my achievements as a storyteller, but also find a personal connection, somebody who they knew and trusted, who knew me as well and could vouch for me, and a lot of times that helped convince people to trust me with their story. That's a really convoluted way of answering your question. I hope you're doing a
No,
lot of editing.
no, it's not. And sorry, Max is interrupting. I'm allowing him to just,
Sweet kitty.
be part of the conversation. But I think you're right. When you're in legacy media or when we worked for Geographic and we approached people with an email like working for Geographic, I didn't realize at the time how much easier that made, like, the barrier of entry was much lower for many people, many places. But now, as independent, people don't know who I am. And the only, I would say, good thing going for me is working for a university. That helps. And also, my LinkedIn is very active and has been for many years. And I think that does help me out. I do approach people on LinkedIn, and shout out to LinkedIn. I do think it's helped me out. Has that
Yeah.
helped at all?
LinkedIn has helped me out, and also, finally, now that I have the podcast and it's generating an audience, I have some decent performance statistics that I can rely on as well. Again, performance to help build that performance-based trust. But, where LinkedIn has really helped me is in identifying some of these stories. Some of these stories from people who've made the pivot from the media world, they're people who I don't know, some who worked at National Geographic or Discovery, but because we're connected to other friends on LinkedIn, they've posted about their pivots, and I've been like, "Oh my god, I need to talk to this person." And again, LinkedIn is helpful because it shows who you have in common, so I can say, "Oh, you worked with so and so. I know them as well. I've started this story. I would love for you to share your story." And yeah, that's where LinkedIn is really helped me.
And I have to admit that when I was looking for people to interview, you were at the top of my list because of your posting about the great pivot or the big pivot. I saw that on LinkedIn and I was like, yeah, this 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 is really great. She can be a really good interview example of this transition between these two worlds. But you popped into my mind because of I was reading through LinkedIn stuff. So
Oh,
there you
yeah.
go. Full circle.
Yeah. Yeah, it gives you this environment too to show women how their story will be promoted. And so with every podcast that I create promos in around a theme. I try to identify a unique theme. With some of them it's balancing starting a business with being a mother. Others it is, this amazing woman when your startup is more of a calling. She had an aversion to hospitals, and she was a copywriter because it was a job she could balance easily with motherhood. And she felt this calling to become a death doula and end of life educator. And so for me, when you're doing a startup around something like that, that feels like a service that everyone should have access to,
Yeah.
something that's so intensely personal. One, how do you promote that? You
Yeah.
know, the topic is death. It's hard to create your, TikTok promo video around that and talk about building trust.
Yeah.
The social media ick factor almost works against trusting this person. But also, how do you build a business around it? How do you create pricing around that kind of service? But it's funny, when I met her, she didn't even have a LinkedIn page. She I met her at a local entrepreneurship group. But being able to create then promotional assets for the podcast, they're also promoting her business. And so being able to offer that too. It's not so much trust building, but adding value to their business and giving them something in return for them sharing their story and trusting me with it and taking time to speak with me.
But I wondered, is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to touch on or we should have touched on? Yeah, think for a second.
I would just say that I think that this whole topic that you're covering is so very important, in that you're exploring this idea of how all these tools that we have available to us today can help us tell these stories that traditional media generally wouldn't cover because it's too hard to monetize them with a mass audience. But there's also this challenge in bringing then these stories to the general public and generating maybe not a mass audience, but even enough of a niche audience in order to monetize them and continue telling them. And that is a struggle. There are a million people who probably bombard my inbox after this telling me about their tool that's just $29.99 a month that will help me get my story out there and get people to listen to my podcast and get people to click on my website, which is a challenge unto itself. But it's a genuine challenge. Again, there are millions of maybe legitimate, maybe charlatan businesses out there that will tell you how you can crack the code. I think a really important part of that recipe is just giving it time. You know, perfect case is MrBeast. What's his name? Jimmy, can't remember his last name. MrBeast, though. You
Yeah,
look at Mr.
Yeah.
Beast, you know, who's this boy billionaire podcaster, YouTuber, not podcaster, boy billionaire YouTuber who landed a series on Amazon. When you watch his first videos that he put out when he was 12 years old, they were not good. They were embarrassing. It was just him playing videos and him talking about playing videos. And he's very, very upfront when he talks about this, about he just kept putting them out there and kept putting them out there and kept putting them out there. And it took 3 or 4 years before he really started generating an audience. But during that time, he got his reps in. What do they say? It takes 10,000 hours to perfect something. You know, he was getting in those reps. I know my first episodes were not perfect, and it was so hard to put them out there, knowing that they had these imperfections. And even now, those some of the edits I just cringe over. The episode I put out today, there's that harsh edit in the open. But you just got to get the reps in and you got to stick with it. And that's the hardest part when you're not seeing that immediate return right away in the first month, in the first 6 months, in the first year, powering through that and trusting the process and continuing to put in the reps. That I think is really what's needed. You're going to improve, your skills will improve, you're going to gradually build that audience. And I see that, you know, in the time that it took me to get the first 100 downloads, or first in the time that it took me to get the first 100 streams of the podcast, then jump to 200, then jump to 400, and then jump to 500. It really has accelerated. So I'm seeing that just 3 months in. So I think a big part of the process for storytellers who are telling these niche stories is just trusting the process and trusting that the audience will come and showing yourself grace. You know, it's so hard because you go on LinkedIn and you go on social media and there are all these ads that are telling you, you need to buy CapCut. You need to buy Opus Clip. This is not sponsored by CapCut or Opus Clip. You need to buy all these different platforms that are gonna, you know, generate these clips for you that are gonna drive audience to you. You get bombarded with these emails telling you why no one's looking at your website and they can help you with your SEO. And it makes you feel like I'm doing everything wrong. Or if I'm not doing everything wrong, there are 10,000 more things that I should be doing that I'm not doing. And why aren't I doing this? And you just have to show yourself grace and let it build, you know, take it step by step and it will come.
What's something, maybe a little thing that you right away learned from your audience?
I think one of the biggest things that I learned from my audience right away that I wasn't as bad as I thought I was. It sounds kind of silly, but again, coming from the media world where when you put out an hour-long product, it has to be more or less perfect. And this harsh edit or that harsh edit or that kind of okay audio would never be acceptable in a broadcast environment, that people will persevere and still listen to it. I think today's audience has a real appreciation for authenticity, and that if something looks or sounds too perfect, they almost don't trust it, you know? And so showing the seams of your work and allowing for imperfections, there's almost, it almost makes it more appealing to a certain audience in a way. And so where I put some of this out there where the audience wasn't perfect, and when I put some of these out there where the audio wasn't perfect, where I was cringing and feeling like, ugh, people are probably shutting this off. People are probably thinking, ugh, what is she trying to do here? I'd get emails from friends who'd say, I listened to your podcast. I loved it. I love that story. That was so moving. This is such an important topic. I can't wait to listen to the next episode. That really gave me the fortitude to continue. If people were listening and powering through these episodes, even when they weren't perfect, it's only going to improve from here on out. And so that was really surprising. And then from the women who I interviewed, listening to them and listening to their needs and getting this idea to have this female founders wish list as part of my offering to give back to these founders who are sharing these stories. That's something that I feel will really help set this apart. And that's a gift that they've given back to me.
Well, I wish you, of course, the most luck. Or I don't know if luck's the best thing to wish, but good vibes, I guess, your way. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, really. And my little closing blurb, if I might. If you want to correct anything or the audience finds something missing, we want to hear from you. I want to hear from you. We will log any updates or corrections in the show notes. And if this episode added something to your thinking, please consider subscribing and passing it along. So, Carrie, thank you. And till we meet again.
Thank you so much, Becky. Professor Becky.
No, that's too professional. Let's do that again. Take two.